Hello, everyone, and welcome. And many thanks to the Rusyn Association of Minnesota for inviting me today to talk about my genealogy research, which I have compiled into a book entitled Freedom Seekers. This is a photo of my paternal grandparents on their wedding day in Chisholm, Minnesota on November 25, 1912. Both were from a territory that no longer exists in Eastern Europe called Galicia, and both identified themselves as Ukrainians, even though they were born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and their villages, Wola Michowa and Smolnik, for most of recorded history, were located in Poland. As was the custom, their marriage had been arranged by their parents in Europe, and they married on a Monday to permit a week-long celebration and avoid any conflicts with Sunday worship or religious holidays. Unlike the custom, my grandmother didn't wear traditional native clothing, but instead chose to wear a white dress, which was something only the nobility did in Europe. So I suspect they were sending an indirect message home that they were doing very well in the United States. I entitled my presentation and book Freedom Seekers because over the course of the past 6 years, I learned that my ancestors were fundamentally a migratory people who valued their independence and yearned to be free. I've organized my presentation into 2 parts. First, I will discuss some of the questions that I researched about my family's ancestry. In the second part, I will discuss my grandparents' experiences as they immigrated to the United States and then settled on Minnesota's Iron Range. Like many amateur genealogists, I really struggled with this because I had so many questions and I really didn't know where to start. So I decided to begin with the family's oral history and work from there. And some of the stories and information I was told by my family were that we were of Ukrainian ancestry and that we might even have a Viking or Jewish ancestry sprinkled in. I knew the names of my grandparents' villages from their immigration materials. My sister and I were told that my great-grandfather was a Cossack and that the Sorokas lived very well under the Tsar. Our family attended a Byzantine Catholic church in Chisholm that my grandfather helped to build in 1916. We assumed that any other relations that we had remained in Europe, except for my grandfather's sister Sophie and my grandmother's brother Stefan, whom we never met. And the only old country story that my grandfather liked to tell my sister and I was about the violin he won in Europe after demonstrating his ability to play, despite never having had lessons himself. So I began my research by investigating the origin and meaning of the Soroko surname. According to Ancestry.com, surnames can sometimes shed light on who our ancestors were, as well as where they came from. In the case of my grandmother, Sivak simply means gray-haired man in Slavic language. But the Soroko surname, it seems, had a little deeper meaning. And what I learned is that Soroko is a common Eastern European name. It's common in Lemkovina, and it's also very common among Jewish individuals. Family surnames, though, are a recent innovation. For most of human history, people were known only by their first name, and in some parts of the world they still are. Surnames were uncommon among the peasants in Eastern Europe because they had no property or titles to pass on to subsequent generations. They also didn't move around very much, so everybody pretty much knew who everyone else was. Then in 1772, the Habsburgs required everyone to adopt a surname for tax and military conscription purposes. Some of these surnames were based on nicknames, occupations, animals, months of the year, or a male ancestor. It was even possible that they would adopt the name of their village of origin as their family surname. Some of the surnames were adopted to make it appear as though they were descendants of nobles. Names that ended in SKI, for example, were reserved for the noble class in Eastern Europe. I discovered that my third great-grandfather, Lucas, bore the Soroko surname prior to 1772, which means that the family owned land. But did this mean that they were part of the noble class? I think that's probably unlikely. First, virtually every member of the aristocracy was Roman Catholic, and my grandparents and ancestors were Greek Catholic. Roman Catholicism, after all, was the state religion of the region. Second, there was nothing documented in their birth records, and members of the nobility carefully documented that legacy in their birth records. There was such a thing as Ruthenian nobles, but most of them converted to Roman Catholicism to preserve their privileged status. Those who remained Ruthenian nobles were mostly from priestly families, who for obvious reasons refused to convert to the Roman Catholic faith. And as far as I know, we didn't have any priests in our family. In his book, Poland, James Michener talks about a hierarchy of peasants. Jan Slomka did as well. Apparently, there were three classes of peasants in the region where my grandparents were from. Landowners, tenants who worked the farms of the landowners, and cottagers who typically didn't own any land but rather ran their own businesses. So what was the source of the Soroko surname? I identified three possibilities. First, in Slavic languages, a soroka is another name for a magpie. Magpies are extremely intelligent birds that have fascinated people for centuries because their behaviors mimic those of human beings. For example, they have been known to hold grudges, learn from each other's mistakes, and even hold funerals for their deceased members. They also played a prominent role in ancient Norse and Slavic mythology. A second possibility is that in Russian, a soroka is a term for a scarf that women were expected to wear, first to avoid attracting evil spirits and later to show their submission to God. A soroka may have been an ancestral occupation, such as weaving or embroidery. But these were primarily women's occupations, and surnames were based on the occupations of men. A third possibility that I found very compelling was that the Soroko surname could have been based on the family's ancestral home. Much like Leonardo da Vinci was from Vinci, perhaps the Sorokas were from Soroko. And there are two communities that are only 100 miles apart that bear the Soroko name in the region where my grandparents lived. It wasn't unusual for people to adopt their ancestral village name as their surname, especially if they were members of the nobility or for some reason decided to relocate. My grandfather only said the Sorokos came from a region north of the Black Sea and didn't specify the name of the village. So this suggests that the family at some point had left their ancestral home. The migration theory resonates with our oral history because of what my grandfather told us, but now, as I will explain, it also resonates with the history of that region. Building on that, my second research question explored why the family would decide to migrate. Most peasants lived and died in the village where they were born for centuries. I suspect the family relocated in the 16th century for three possible reasons. The first of these possible reasons is that the inhabitants of Eastern Europe were the target of constant invasions by the Mongols, Tartars, and Ottoman Turks between the 12th and 17th centuries, during which their villages would either be destroyed, and they would be robbed and murdered, or sold into slavery. According to Diane Larry, many people migrated either after their villages had been attacked or due to fear of being attacked. The Soroko community in Moldova was well fortified, but the one near Ternopil was not. In the 16th century, the Tartars invaded the Ternopil region. The second reason might have been to escape the expansion of serfdom. The Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth had established their economy on an export-driven grain market, which in turn was based on free labor, or in other words, serfdom. It was about the same time as the Turks and Tartars were attacking in earnest that the Polish aristocracy was also beginning to tighten their grip. Border communities were established by runaway serfs who were trying to escape the growing reach of serfdom in both Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the 15th and 16th centuries. Running to the Carpathian Mountains, or in other words, heading for the hills, was described as a call to freedom. A third reason for why the family may have migrated was that the King of Poland incentivized settlement in the Carpathians in the 16th century. The Polish king was aware of the continual threat of invasion, so he wanted to settle the Carpathians to serve as a type of human shield. So he established royal villages, like Smolnik and Wolomichowa, in the uninhabited Carpathian region, promising the new settlers land free of feudal obligations for 24 years. In return, however, the Rusyns were expected to provide military defense and guard the roads and borders. And the defense that the Rusyns provided was very important, both to maintain control of important trade routes that went through Galicia, as well as the tariff revenues that were collected on those imports and exports. The defense was also needed to guard against foreign invasion, because the eastern marauders were not the only threat. There were internal threats as well. During the reigns of Casimir's sons, the Polish monarchy had given up a great deal of its power to the nobility, and by weakening their realm, they exposed it to the aggression of neighboring states, most especially the Teutonic Knights and the state of Muscovy. The Polish monarchy continued to lose power to its nobility during the 16th century as a result of the expansion of their golden freedoms, such that when Sigismund II ascended the throne in 1548, he spent most of his time appeasing the gentry, who would not give him really any latitude in making decisions, including approving of any declaration of war. After he died, Poland began a process of electing their kings, and those kings were generally selected from a candidate pool of individuals outside the Commonwealth to add further checks on the monarch's autocratic powers. And there were two important trade routes and mountain passes very near Wolomichowa. The Dukla Pass is still a major commercial route for trafficking goods between Poland and Slovakia. My next research question was to confirm the family's Ukrainian ethnicity. While conducting my research, I discovered new terms that I hadn't heard of before, like Ruthenian, Rusyn, and Lemkos, terms that my grandparents never used to describe their ethnicity. Both of my grandparents' villages are located in the Lemko region in what is today southeast Poland, but their immigration documents identified them as Ruthenians. For most of recorded history, their homelands were either ruled or controlled by Polish landowners. Prior to the 19th century, a person's ethnicity was determined by their cultural and religious beliefs rather than by a country's borders. So it really was a matter of choice. Ukraine was a Jewish term that meant frontier or borderland. Some historians say that the term Ukrainian didn't describe an ethnicity, however, but rather a military community that lived in the borderlands of Russia. During the nationalism movement in Europe during the late 19th century, individuals from my grandparents' villages began to identify as either Russophiles or Russians, or Ukrainophiles, and thus as Ukrainians. Russia obviously already existed as a nation, but Ukraine did not. Those who identified as Ukrainophiles wanted to establish their own nation. And when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was established, those who identified as Ukrainians almost succeeded in creating their own nation. But instead, Galicia went to Poland and Volhynia went to Lithuania. Rusyns, who were loyal to the Byzantine Catholic Church or Greek Catholic, tended to be pro-Ukrainian. In contrast, the Russian Orthodox members of Rusyn society saw their identity as being Russian. Members of the Soroko family were represented in both camps because some worshipped in the Byzantine Catholic Church while others were members of the Russian Orthodox community. So the Sorokas are Rusyns that identified with different countries. The Russophiles felt they needed a powerful nation like Russia to liberate them from the Austrian Empire. The Ukrainians related more to peasant culture and Cossack traditions and was more of a bottom-up sort of movement. The borders of ruling nations changed a great deal over the centuries, particularly in Eastern Europe, which culminated in demands for various groups in the late 19th century for formal recognition and more democratic forms of government. Prior to World War I, the heir to the Habsburg crown wanted to create a United States of Austria, giving each ethnic group its own territory. But he was assassinated before he had the chance. The next research question that I decided to explore was if our family was Jewish or Vikings, or possibly both. Let me begin by exploring a possible Jewish heritage. 1/3 of my grandfather's village was Jewish, and many were involved in the Hungarian wine trade and in livestock trading. The community had 2 synagogues and a Jewish cemetery. But why did so many Jews live in Galicia? First, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire had issued a royal charter inviting Jews to their territory to perform jobs that they thought were below the dignity of Christian gentlemen or prohibited by the Catholic Church. Second, Galicia was situated just on the periphery of the Jewish Pale, a region in which Catherine the Great had exiled their newly acquired Jewish citizens as a result of the partitions of Poland, when the Jews refused to convert to the Russian Orthodox faith. They were still persecuted in the Pale, however, so many of them decided to leave, especially since the Polish landowners thought so highly of them. In fact, a common saying was that a Polish nobleman was incomplete without a Jew. Jews were involved in trade and also worked as craftspeople, as tailors, hat makers, stonemasons, metal workers, butchers, and so forth. They served as bankers and managed the mills and taverns as leaseholders, called arrendators on behalf of the Polish aristocracy. They were forbidden to own their own land, however, so many of them worked for cruel and corrupt landowners who used them to oppress the peasants. For this reason and their role in the production and sale of alcohol, anti-Semitism began to grow throughout Eastern Europe. In his book, Memoirs of a Peasant, Jan Slomka accused Jews of luring peasants and even nobles to sign over their property after they borrowed money for alcohol and defaulted on their loans. Slomka also referred to the Jewish businessmen who he competed against, claiming that they were unethical in their business dealings. But he also said that the Jews were responsible for their own success because they avoided alcohol and worked very hard to get ahead. As you can see from my DNA analysis, there is no evidence of Jewish ancestry in my DNA. I do, however, have evidence of German DNA, which I suppose isn't surprising given that all the rulers of Eastern Europe had at one time or another invited Germans to settle in their region because Germans created what they considered a civilizing effect on wherever they lived. Revered for their agricultural expertise and orderly governance methods, they were offered incentives such as free land, livestock, exemption from taxes, or even military service to entice them to settle in their region. My great-grandfather lived in Germany for many years, so the Soroko celebrated Christmas by exchanging gifts, something that other Rusyns in their community did not do. I also didn't have any evidence of Scandinavian DNA. So does that mean I'm not a descendant of the Vikings, who are considered by some to be the forefathers of what would be called the Rus and later the Russian nation? Well, like many of my discoveries, it's complicated. Recent archaeological examination of Viking remains in Sweden suggests that some Vikings were not Scandinavian at all. They were Slavic. And even if I was Scandinavian, only a small percentage of Scandinavians were actually Vikings. It was an occupation, not an ethnicity. During the Viking Age, however, all Scandinavians began to be referred to as Vikings. So this hypothesis could neither be confirmed or denied. My fifth research question was to pursue the notion of Cossacks, because I couldn't understand why a Rusyn farmer living in Poland or the Austrian Empire would claim to be a Cossack. According to John Righetti, many Rusyn families claim to have a Cossack heritage. So what would explain this? And why did my grandfather say things were better under the Tsar? Was he referring to the Austrian emperor as the Tsar? Well, as it turns out, there is no universal definition of a Cossack, and its meaning and scope expanded over time. Initially, Cossacks were runaway serfs or fugitives who ran away to border communities to live on the fringe of society in order to be free of the aristocracy and serfdom. They had to create their own militia to defend themselves because the aristocracy certainly wasn't going to do it. And they lived in communes that provided social welfare for their members. Cossacks also believed that all children needed to be taught how to read and write. They were admired by the peasants because they were the Eastern European equivalent of Robin Hood, and they were equally hated by the nobility. After a time, ruling governments stopped trying to round up the Cossacks and instead incorporated them into their regular military. Russian Cossacks served an important function. In Russia, all 5,000 miles of its southern border is devoid of natural boundaries or defenses like large bodies of water or mountains, and needed regular patrolling. The steppes served as a sort of ancient freeway for enemy invaders. In Tsarist Russia, Cossacks lived pretty well, relatively speaking, at least according to Albert Seton in his book called The Cossacks. But were Cossacks in Poland or the Austrian Empire? In Poland and Austria, there apparently evolved two kinds of Cossacks. Registered Cossacks, who were part of the regular military and served in the light infantry, and town Cossacks who served as border guards and frontier police officers. And I was able to find evidence of Cossacks in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Martin Rady's book called The Habsburgs. My great-grandfather was a Germanized Slav, having served in Germany for many years, such that he was a pretty old man when he married for the first time, and 43 years old when my grandfather, his firstborn son, was born. Poland is also a largely flat territory. For the same reason, therefore, a type of Cossack military was needed to protect its borders. Not only against enemy invasion, but also to protect those tariff revenues, which were a prime source of government resource. I wasn't able to find any records of my great-grandfather's military service. The two Polish genealogists that I hired said that the records had been destroyed in World War II. But I did find my second great-grandfather served in the light infantry for 11 years. The light infantry, or Cossacks, were responsible for destroying enemy supply lines and softening the enemy prior to battle. They also had to be excellent horsemen. And as it turns out, a type of military horse was bred in the region where my grandparents lived. I discovered that the Sorokas owned pasture lands near the horse breeding operation in Wola-Michowa. The Malopolska horse, or the Little Poland horse, was known as a versatile mount who was good in both agriculture and military service. I circled the area where the horse breeding operation was in Wola-Michowa on the map to identify where it was. So what can I conclude about the origins of the Soroko family? First, I believe that the Sorokas probably migrated from the village named Soroko near Ternopil, and they decided to adopt its name as the family surname. I think they left the region both to escape serfdom and the constant incursion of Eastern invaders, as well as to get free land from the king. I think they may have gotten additional land for providing military service for the king after they'd settled there. Ethnic identification for those with origins in Galicia were based primarily on their religious beliefs rather than a nation's borders. During the nationalism movement of the 19th century, however, Sorokas who were Byzantine Catholic tended to identify themselves as Ukrainians, while those who continued to be faithful to the Orthodox religion tended to consider themselves as Russians. My DNA suggests or confirms that I'm not Jewish or a descendant of Swedish Vikings. But I did have evidence of German DNA, given the strong presence of Germans in the region, and I learned that some Vikings were actually Slavic. I also saw some similarities between how Vikings lived and the Rusyns lived, in the sense that they were both subsistence farmers and they both lived in dwellings that housed not only the family but also their livestock. My grandfathers, I believe, were cavalrymen who also worked to guard the borders and were therefore described as Cossacks. They may have even supplied horses or livestock to the military, given that they owned pasture lands near those operations in the village of Wola-Michowa. I think that living well under the Tsar might have meant that they had concluded that the Tsar treated Cossacks better than their own ruling government. In this next part of my presentation, I'd like to talk about my grandparents' immigration to the United States, as well as their eventual settlement in Chisholm, Minnesota. So the question that I examined first was what would compel them to leave? And based on my research, I didn't find any reasons that would compel them to stay. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had decided long ago that Galicia was to serve three purposes. First, to supply men for their imperial army. Second, to provide cheap labor to produce food for their entire empire. And third, to serve as a land buffer with neighboring Russia. The emperor didn't want to industrialize the province, didn't want to educate Galicians so they could perform other work, and was even unwilling to install train transportation to reduce the isolation of the region until the First World War. There was growing ethnic tension as different groups demanded more democratic methods of government. And famines and epidemics were occurring on average of every 6 or 7 years. Thanks to the invention of the steam engine, and along with it steamships and steam-powered trains, as well as advances in agricultural technology, grain imports from the United States and Britain depressed grain prices across Europe. In order to survive, the Sorokas chose to live communally, with as many as 20 people living under the same roof. My grandfather had also reached the age of conscription, and his father warned him of an impending war. All of these factors contributed to his decision to leave. My grandmother was quite simply starving to death, working as a servant for a nearby farm. Her father had died as a result of a mining accident in Minnesota, and her siblings were all in the United States. Her mother was also an alcoholic, which was another epidemic in Galicia. It was said that the average peasant consumed 1 gallon of hard liquor every week. Edward Steiner described the plight of someone like my grandmother, making it impossible for her to leave the country without a sponsor. Many young women in the same predicament decided to join a convent, but my grandmother's brother was working in a mine near Chisholm and paid her passage. A ticket was roughly $30, and it was also recommended that you have another $25 to help you get settled in the United States. Early on, the Austrian government actively encouraged people to leave Galicia, because at the time 50,000 people were dying of starvation every year. In 1900, however, the government became concerned about all the military-age men who were leaving the country, and so they began to require passports and other forms of authorization in order to leave the country. Some left under an assumed name of a relative who had already successfully immigrated to the United States. Others crossed illegally into a bordering country and then left from there. Everyone took advantage of these poor migrants, inflating the price of their tickets, telling them they couldn't get into the United States in their village clothing, and so on. Both of my grandparents traveled by themselves, which I thought was incredibly brave, especially for my grandmother, because it was not customary for women to travel by themselves. The only modern transport leaving from my grandparents' village was a narrow-gauge railroad that was used to move natural resources like timber from the Carpathian Mountains. So the first part of the journey was probably on foot. Once they reached Germany, they tended to depart from either Hamburg or Bremen. Supposedly only single men left from Hamburg, and my grandfather did in fact leave from that city. My grandmother left from Bremen. Overcrowded conditions were typical for those who traveled in third class or steerage. This photo was taken in 1906, the same year that my grandfather came from Europe. 3,000 people were in steerage on his voyage. My dad only told me that my grandmother slept in a lifeboat. And Edward Steiner's description of those in steerage probably explains why she decided to do that. Many immigrants said that they were sick for most of the voyage. But some immigrants said the trip wasn't so bad. They had toilet paper for the first time in their lives and enough to eat. Barrels of herring were left on the decks of the ships and were there free for the taking. In the original ship's manifest, my grandfather's last name was transcribed as Yozapa, which explains why I couldn't find him. In this version, however, I was able to gather more information. Things I didn't know, like he could speak English and Polish, had no plans to go home, and he said that he paid for the ticket himself. He was going to Plymouth to work in the coal mines, and he was meeting his cousin Alex Soroko when he arrived. Note that his age was incorrect, however. He was 19, not 39. In the more detailed version of my grandmother's manifest, she said she was traveling to Chisholm, Minnesota, and that her brother had paid her passage. She had $12 in her pocket upon arrival, so she stayed with her sister in New York and worked there for 6 months before venturing to Minnesota by train. My grandfather's home for the next 3 years was Plymouth, Pennsylvania, where he worked in the underground coal mines. Initially, agents of the coal companies preferred to hire English-speaking immigrants, but they could assimilate into American society and seek other opportunities. So over time, they began to favor Eastern Europeans. Besides being of smaller stature like children, thanks to years of malnutrition, they were also accustomed to living in shabby housing and working for next to nothing. Living in coal patch communities was bleak and depressing, but many Rusyns preferred to live as cheaply as possible so they could save money to go back home to buy land or possibly pay off family debts. It wasn't uncommon to return home and then re-enter the United States multiple times. Those who came to the U.S. to farm were less likely to return than those who worked for wages. So why did my grandfather decide to leave Pennsylvania? Well, one was that he was getting married, and there were few marriageable age women living in coal country. And two, because it was said to be so much better than mining coal. A number of individuals from his or neighboring villages had moved to Chisholm between 1910 and 1913, including my grandfather's uncle. At some point, my grandmother's brother left the area and moved out east, settling in New York and running a farm. My grandmother's sister Anne died in childbirth. Chisholm was founded by Archibald Chisholm. He never lived in the community, but he named his land the Glen to honor his former Scottish homeland. Chisholm was a very prosperous community at the time. And thanks to mining revenues, many of these communities built fabulous schools and government buildings. But this is where my grandparents lived, and their 5 sons were born, in Glen location just outside of Chisholm. Locations were temporary communities built right next to mining excavations to enable the men to walk to work. Much like coal patch communities, the locations were pretty depressing. They were completely devoid of vegetation, and the homes were not particularly well insulated, so they were very cold. My uncle said on wash day it was particularly miserable because then the homes were cold and damp. Some locations like the Glen were built by mining engineers. I've highlighted both my parents' homes because I was surprised to learn that they lived almost right next to each other. The Glen location was built around 1910 and didn't close until 1930, when it became cost prohibitive for the company to offer services that competed with nearby towns. Most of the single men lived in company-run boarding houses, which employed a hot bed system, which meant that the bed was occupied by someone almost 24 hours a day. Other locations were not built by the company, but rather by the miners themselves, and were known as squatter locations. Here's a photo of Pool location just outside of Chisholm. Homes were basically erected anywhere space could be found, and at least initially there was no plumbing or electrical, and the roads were uneven and unpaved. Few location homes survived into contemporary times because they were built to be temporary structures. But the Soroko residence survived because it had been used as a hunting shack before being donated to the Minnesota Discovery Center just outside of Chisholm for their Glen location exhibit. So this is the Soroko residence. It wasn't their first. It was a larger home to accommodate their growing family. The average monthly rent for a home of this size was about $12.50, or 7 days' wages each month. Prior to the Sorokas, the residence served as a home for 13 different individuals. Everyone worked hard, especially the women, because everything had to be done by hand. And so families favored having girls over boys because there was always so much housework to do. And girls could take care of boarders if the family chose to take in a renter or two. Unfortunately, my grandmother had all boys. Even still, everyone had a job to do, and there was little time for recreation. While some families emancipated their kids at a very young age, in my mother's family, they left home at age 12 or 13, the Sorokas continued to live together, and the boys didn't leave home until they either went into the military or got married. But even after they got married, my grandfather would invite them to live together under the same roof. This is the head frame or elevator that my grandfather took to descend into the mines 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, for $2 a day in wages. On Sundays, he would lay on the grass and look at the sky, something that he hadn't seen all week. Working in the underground mines was an extremely hazardous occupation. Imagine yourself working day after day in complete darkness with people who didn't speak the same language as you did. The men constantly worried that the log supports would give out and they would be buried alive, or worse, that the mine shaft would flood with water and they would drown. Air conditions were also extremely poor in the underground, so many of the men developed heart and lung disorders. The men were also not treated particularly well by the mining companies because they could easily be replaced at little cost. Unlike the mules, would have to be purchased and trained. J.P. Morgan took control of the Iron Range when he decided to consolidate the American steel industry, buying out Carnegie and Rockefeller, and then working tirelessly to thwart unionization. Morgan not only controlled the mines, but also area businesses and virtually every aspect of the miners' lives. Anyone who challenged his enterprise would be destroyed. Finnish immigrants were blacklisted by the mining companies because they were militant unionizers. Mining officials compared the Iron Range to the killing fields of World War I during the bloody strike of 1916. Initially, the company said that the men themselves bore total responsibility for injury and death. They also paid them as contract miners, which meant that they were paid by the ton of ore they extracted rather than paid an hourly wage. So the men had to buy all of their mining supplies, and many of them resorted to bribing company supervisors for the best mining locations, which might include sexual encounters with their daughters. It wasn't until the 1930s, when worker protection legislation was enacted, that working conditions really improved for the miners. But underground mining did not cease until 1960 because it was still cheaper than open pit mining. My dad always talked about the enormous cabbages you would find surrounding location homes. I found this photo of a location in Ely, but it reminded me of what he described. Locations were located right on the edge of the mine, so it wasn't uncommon to have homes shelled by mining blasts. So how did they cope in the midst of all this hardship? Well, they had a strong belief in God. The church served both their spiritual needs and their need to belong and be part of a community. They didn't just attend church, they were the church. My dad often complained about how much time his dad spent on church matters because he was seldom home to help his overworked mother. This is what remains of my grandparents' mining endeavors. The region is now redeveloping the mining area to be a recreational site. The underground mines have long since caved in and filled with water. So this concludes my presentation. I hope that you found it informative and perhaps helpful to your own genealogical research. If you have any questions, we can discuss them now, or you can send me an email afterwards at the email on the screen. Thanks.